Hi, I'm Karen. Thanks for joining me today. I'm just going to start off with just a quick practice of arch and flatten, a little bit of a tutorial and instruction. So arch and flatten is a practice that we use to check in. It's also a practice that we use to relieve tension in the spine. So often when we have tension around the trunk, our spine gets locked up. It's supposed to be able to move in 6 directions. So we're working with 2 directions with our arch and flatten, which are called flexion and extension. So the practice can be done in a chair or on your mat, or it can be practiced in your bed. I'm going to do it on the floor first, and then I'll do another video that shows the arch and flatten done in the chair. So go ahead and find yourself onto the floor, coming onto your back with your knees in a bent position. So the principles of somatics really are that we want to be moving with great awareness of what it is that we're doing. So I like to actually use my hands to give me some feedback. So I'm going to have you bring your hands onto the bones of your pelvis. So we can feel those bones that stick out on the front of the pelvis, and then you can feel the back of the pelvis. Generally, you feel the back of the pelvis resting into the floor. I also want you to take note here, just as you rest on your back, the curve of your lumbar spine, so the way that your spine curves away from the floor, and maybe even noticing where your spine connects to the floor again, up in the rib cage area, and where you notice weight into the back of your head. So those reference points we'll be checking in with again after. So I'm going to start to have you move into an arch. So when we move into an arch, we're going to take our tailbone and we tip it towards the floor, which is going to lift the lower back away from the floor. And you're going to try to move in a way that you're not going to increase pain if you have a current level of low back pain. And once you've gone to your end range of motion, then you slowly let that movement release. Let your body come back to settle in what we call neutral here, and then practice that movement again. So you tip your tailbone towards the mat, and then your top of your pelvis lifts away from the floor, and then we slowly let that release again. So with somatics, we're paying attention to feeling and sensing the movement, the muscles that are bringing you into that contraction, and then we slowly let that release. From there, we're going to go in the opposite direction, and we take our tailbone and we curl it away from the floor. So that rolls your pubic bone towards your navel, and we flatten our low back into the mat. And then we slowly let that release, letting our spine come back into neutral. And then practice that movement again. So we want to gain control of our abdominal muscles here. So we want to make sure that we're not pushing down into our feet to push the low back into the floor. We want the legs to remain quite inactive, and all the activity is actually coming from the muscles of the abdomen, contracting to press the low back into the mat, and then we slowly let that release. Again, you want to try to sense and feel the activity of those muscles in the lower, in the abdomen, and then we let that release. So it's called arch and flatten. So we generally go between your arch. We take the time to move the pelvis into the arch, paying attention, feeling and sensing where the effort is coming from, and then we slowly let that release, letting the spine return and the pelvis return to neutral, and then going in the opposite direction to our flatten. And then allowing that contraction in the abdomen to release, returning you back into neutral. So I like to also tie the breath into this. So generally when we go into our arch, you inhale, taking that whole inhale to find your arch, and then allow your exhale to unite with releasing those muscles. And then take a pause in the middle on your inhale. And on your exhale, move towards your flatten, where you curl your tailbone away from the floor, and then your inhale will return you back to neutral. And then practice that a couple more times in the rhythm of your breath, inhaling into arch, releasing as you exhale. On your next inhale, you can take the pause, and then your exhale, you roll towards your flatten. And practicing one more without any cueing. And then once you're complete, we'll add on to that arch by inviting the upper spine into it as well. So taking the head and just gently press your head into the mat and then let it go. Chances are when you press the head into the mat, you're going to start to feel a little bit of activity in the upper spine, wanting to try to lift the rib cage away from the floor, and then we slowly let that go. And then unite that with the tailbone pressing towards the mat. So we press the head into the mat and the tailbone presses towards the floor. You'll likely feel a little more contraction up the entire length of the spine, and then we slowly let that release, letting the spine return to neutral. And again, you can practice that on an inhale. So you press the head and the tailbone towards the mat, lifting the spine away from the mat, and then slowly letting it release. When we go towards the flatten, we take the lower ribs, if you like to place your hands on your lower ribs, and then start to roll your lower ribs down towards the pubic bone. The pubic bone rolls towards the navel and the ribs, and then we slowly let that contraction release. You might have the tendency to want to lift your head here, but for this level, just let the head remain on the floor. And chances are when you contract the abdominal muscles and you're trying to curl your spine, the back of the neck will start to arch, and then we slowly release. So we'll unite that movement again with our exhale. So as you exhale, you go towards your flatten, the upper and lower abdominals are contracting, and then we slowly let that release. And then we'll alternate between an arch and a flatten again. So on your inhale, you move towards your arch, pressing the head towards the mat, tailbone towards the mat. Feel that contraction in the back. And then consciously let that contraction release, letting the spine return to neutral. And on your next exhale, move towards a flatten. Pubic bone and ribs roll towards each other, creating this contraction in the abdomen. And then we slowly let it release. Take the time to connect to your breath cycle again before going into the next repetition. So it's an inhale as we arch. Exhale as you release. Inhale in neutral. Exhale into your flatten. Inhale to consciously release those contractions, letting yourself return to neutral, and practice one more on your own without any cueing. once you return back to neutral, taking a moment again just to connect in with the places where your spine and your pelvis are connecting to the floor, maybe even noticing the back of the head. Notice if there's any sense of change that may have occurred with just those tiny movements of the spine. The position or the relationship of the spine and the pelvis to the floor may have changed. Okay, thanks for tuning in.